The quest for every single NBA team, I would hope at least, is to win an NBA championship. From the sheer competitive nature of the sport to the buzz it brings and the revenue being a championship team makes a city, if you are in the NBA, becoming a championship team is something that most teams try to make a stride towards every single year. Now, every team isn't the same. Every team in the league is at different stages, so making strides to become a championship team is different for every single team. For the teams at the top, you're more so retooling to fix out the chinks in your armor. But from the teams at the bottom and the teams in the middle of the pack, well, there's different ideologies to tackle that matter. A majority of these teams understand that they're not going to win a championship in the immediate future, so many of the teams in this area do moves that are supposed to set them up to compete in the long term. A decent amount of these teams are just naturally bad for whatever reason, which earns them a valuable draft pick in an upcoming draft, even though being bad was something that they didn't really want to be. But there are numerous teams throughout NBA history that have tried to take advantage of the draft system in place in the NBA by a method called tanking. So in this video, I want to take a deeper look at tanking, the history of tanking, what exactly is tanking, is it good, is it bad, does it work, does it not? We about to go crazy in this video. I do want to shout out the Let's Keep It a Buck podcast real quick, not just because, you know, it's the best podcast in the land, at least on Twitch when it comes to basketball, that doesn't have an NBA player in it, but also it truly did inspire the topic of this video. This was a conversation we had on the pod, and honestly, if you haven't been following the pod, I've been very, very proud of the strides we've made recently. We just reached 6,000 subscribers, and we're getting around 150, 200 viewers live on Twitch. TikTok growing. We just recreated TNT's all-time draft idea from like a decade ago with me, the rest of the crew, Dom2K, Low, Click, Rusty. Like, we're going crazy, man. So go ahead, check it out. Links will be in the description. Top link, pinned comment as well. But let's get into the topic of this video, and that is tanking. So what exactly is tanking? Well, first, we need to understand that the NBA draft and the order of the draft picks are decided off of a lottery system, and it's been this way since the 1985 draft. Before then, the draft order was actually purely based off of the worst records in the league in inverse order, aside from the top 2 picks in the draft, which were actually decided by just a coin flip between the teams with the worst record in each conference. Now, the 1985 rule change that I mentioned earlier only really changed it so that the top 3 picks are now decided by a lottery between the 3 worst records in the league. So the lottery we're familiar with today really wouldn't be set in place until 1994. But ever since then, sometime during the playoffs, the NBA does a lottery based off of the standings in the NBA to determine the order of the first 14 picks of the upcoming NBA draft. Going into this lottery, the odds for every team are determined by their record in the prior NBA season, with the team in the league with the worst record getting the best odds, the second worst team record-wise getting the second best odds, so on and so forth. Now, they have changed the way they determine the lottery odds in recent years, which is something we'll definitely get into later in this video, but nevertheless, the point is, it is a system that gives teams with bad records a chance to get a good draft pick in order to give them a possible building block to eventually become a competitive team in the future. Now, tanking, to put simply, is when a team deliberately loses games in the regular season in order to get higher odds in the draft lottery with hopes of getting a higher draft pick in the upcoming draft. So when did all of this start? When did tanking start? Where did it originate from? Now, I don't really think there was a clear starting point to tanking. Near the end of every season, there just becomes a point where teams just know they're out of the picture and cool off on trying. So if you want to say that counts as tanking, then feel free, be my guest. Now, depending on how you look at it, the 1983 Rockets could have been one of the first teams to ever tank, because in the 1982 offseason, the Rockets for some reason didn't want to pay Moses Malone as a restricted free agent, despite the man leading them to an NBA Finals appearance and winning the MVP in his last 2 years there respectively. So you know what the Rockets did instead? They traded him to the 76ers and got a bag of Fritos. That's what happened. And the Rockets, knowing they were going to be very bad in the next upcoming season, they decided to not try as much in that upcoming season, ending with a horrendous 14-68 record, a terrible record, but a record that would land them star big man Ralph Sampson in the next draft. But maybe you don't consider that tanking because that's just one of those cases where they were just naturally bad after losing an MVP caliber player for a bag of chips. One of the first teams that started giving up earlier than normal was actually the 1984 Rockets, who considered their season a wash after starting the season 20-26. Pretty much halfway to the season, with them still having a chance at making the playoffs, as two teams ended up making the cut with a 38-44 record, the Rockets decided to play their bench more so they can lose more games and tank to the bottom of the league so they can get a really good draft pick in this upcoming draft. They would finish the rest of the season with a 8-28 record and ended up with the third worst record in the league. However, keep in mind this was literally the last draft, where the top two picks in the draft were determined by a coin flip between the worst record in each conference, with the rest of the draft being in inverse order. And despite the Rockets having the third worst record in the league, because they had the worst record in the Western Conference, they now had a 50-50 shot at getting the #1 overall pick, and that is what happened. They actually got the #1 overall pick. Now let me just remind you, the 1984 draft specifically is arguably the greatest draft class of all time. This is a draft class that features Hakeem Olajuwon, Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, John Stockton, and many more. And the Rockets systematically got themselves a 50-50 shot, technically the best odds, tied for the best odds, to get the #1 overall pick in this draft, which ended up being none other than Hakeem Olajuwon, who would end up being what many consider, at the very least, a top 12 player in NBA history. Now, aside from those Rockets teams, there is a gray area in what classifies as tanking. Some teams inherently are just bad after a season filled with injuries, and they just decided to give up earlier than usual, and that's what happened with the 1997 San Antonio Spurs, which then resulted in them getting Tim Duncan. There are also teams that are just flat out bad because they lost a star the season prior, and their inability to fill that void got them a high draft pick. But in the 2010s, the idea of tanking has been much more talked about. And more than ever, this idea of being bad for consecutive years in order to stack high draft picks to build a solid young core is a tactic that's been carried out by way more teams than the eras previously. Even if you look at the interest of the word tanking, it didn't really peak until 2009, at least according to Google Trends. But something does tell me that has something to do more with politics than basketball. But even when we narrow down the term to tanking NBA, tanking is something that's been more prevalent in the last decade compared to the decades prior, again at least according to Google Trends. And you see the spike around 2013? Well, I'm almost 100% sure that that spike was caused by the most blatant case of tanking in NBA history, and that is the Philadelphia 76ers. More specifically, the Sam Hinkie trust the process Philadelphia 76ers. After a season where the 76ers finished as the 9th seed in the conference, Sam Hinkie, the GM of the 76ers at the time, realized that the franchise wasn't really going anywhere. If the team making a conference finals is an extremely massive overachievement, what does that really mean? If a team is just perennially getting 5th or 6th seeds in the conference and getting bounced out in the first round, what does that really mean? And Sam Hinkie decided that starting in the 2013 season, the 76ers will blatantly, and I mean blatantly, tank multiple seasons in order to gain as high of a draft pick as they can, so down the line they can have this homegrown super team that's going to win championships upon championships upon championships. I mean, just think about it. Imagine if they did this in the early 2000s, got the #1 overall pick every single year, and had a 3-year stretch of drafting Yao Ming, LeBron James, and Dwight Howard. Why not make the system work in your favor, especially if you're a small market team with no reason for free agents to come to your team? And that ideology is exactly what the 76ers would do for the next consecutive years. In the 2014 season, the 76ers would tank that season, and somehow still didn't end with the worst record in the league, shout out to the Bucks, but nevertheless still landed them the 3rd pick in the draft, where they would draft Joel Embiid, who was expected to miss most if not all of his first season, but that didn't really matter. If anything, it was a good thing because they planned to tank anyways. They would then follow that up by drafting Jahlil Okafor in the following draft, despite already having Nerlens Noel and Joel Embiid as either a backup plan due to Embiid's shaky health, or just a pick the most talented player on the board type of pick. And then in the following season, once again, you guessed it, the 76ers would tank that season, a horrible 10-72 record. 10-72. That is literally the inverse of the second greatest record in NBA history. Like, bro, how are you that bad, bro? And with the number 1 overall draft pick, the 76ers would then draft Ben Simmons, who was the clear-cut number 1 pick in the draft at that time. And then with Ben Simmons missing all of his first year as well, and Joel Embiid still barely playing because the 76ers wanted to be cautious with his health, the 76ers would then continue on their hot streak, if that's what you want to call it, a hot streak, and got the 3rd overall pick in the 2017 NBA draft, which they would actually then trade to the Boston Celtics to move up even more, all the way up to once again the number 1 overall draft pick, where they would draft Markelle Fultz, the at the time unanimous number 1 pick of that draft. And ever since that season, the 76ers have become a perennial playoff team built around Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid, were borderline championship contenders in 2019 and in 2021, however still have yet to actually win a championship. But after the 2018 season, it was clear that if you wanted an easy way to get very talented players that you can build your franchise around, tanking was the way to go. And other teams may have not directly looked at the 76ers as influence or referred to the Sixers as influence, and definitely didn't go to the extremes that the Sixers did, but I do believe their efforts raised this general notion that being a perennial 4th to 10th seed is actually the worst spot to be in as an NBA franchise, because you're not really competing for championships and you're simultaneously not getting any cornerstones in the upcoming NBA draft. And the teams that were influenced by this notion, in my opinion, were the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Phoenix Suns. But with the 76ers yet to make an NBA Finals appearance, and them being on the verge of breaking up their duo of Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, which was a product of them tanking, it has begged the question of if the process worked, and if tanking as a whole was 1, bad for the league, and 2, if it even worked. So what does the NBA think of tanking, and what have they done or not done to combat it? Well, actually, the NBA had a pretty direct answer to that statement, and had a direct action to back it up. In 2017, the NBA instated a rule that would go effect in the 2019 NBA draft, which reduced the lottery odds so that the 3 worst records would share the same chance of receiving the number 1 overall draft pick, with the rest of the teams with the worst records going down from that. What this did was make the odds way more even, while still giving the teams with the worst records some sort of competitive edge in the lottery. Now, before this rule in the prior format, there used to be a whopping 19.7% difference in the odds between the 6th worst team in the league record-wise getting the number 1 pick compared to the team with the worst record. However, under these new rules, the difference between the 6th worst team record-wise in the league and the team with the worst record is now just a mere 5%. And also in 2018, Adam Silver went on record and said, "We have been careful to distinguish between efforts teams may make to rebuild their rosters, including through personal changes over the course of several seasons, and circumstances in which players or coaches on the floor take steps to lose games. The former can be a legitimate strategy to construct a successful team within the confines of the league's rules. The latter, which we have not found and hope to never see in the NBA, has no place in our game. If we ever received evidence that players or coaches were attempting to lose or otherwise taking steps to cause any game to result otherwise than on its competitive merits, that conduct would be met with the swiftest and harshest response possible from the league office." Now, reading that quote, I ain't gonna lie, this may have been a case of innocent till proven guilty when it came to the Sixers, because to me it was pretty blatant with the way they were tanking. But I guess this was a statement meant to be more of a moving forward type of statement than it was, we haven't found any evidence. Like, come on, Adam, you're capping on this one. You're capping. But why exactly was there so much animosity, so much hatred towards tanking? Many have argued that tanking has diminished the product of the NBA in a pretty massive way. Fans are paying hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to go to a game already knowing the outcome of it because one team is purposely losing. One could also argue that tanking unfairly aids certain playoff teams in their seeding in the end of the season when the second half of their schedules are filled with teams that are tanking compared to other teams who don't have that same luxury, at least to the extent of some other playoff teams. But from a management standpoint, there's also this notion that tanking isn't even a solution to building a championship contender. This crowd believes that the real way of building a championship contender is building a winning culture and raising the value of your assets to possibly acquire proven talent via trades or free agency. These people also believe that building a championship team more so has to do with being better at drafting players and having a strong player development department rather than betting on young players to just team up and make it work. So when you combine that thinking along with the ideology that tanking is damaging the product of the league by abusing a systematic flaw, then that is a very valid argument as to why tanking can be bad. On the other side of the spectrum, there's a crowd that believes in a free NBA market. What's wrong with taking advantage of a system to your favor when any team in the league can do it? Nothing's stopping anyone else from doing it. What's wrong with thinking about long-term team building by sacrificing the now? And if this strategy can in turn lead to the next NBA super team, which some NBA fans have already argued is something actually good for the league to have, then what's wrong with tanking? Tanking, to an extent, is a way to combat a system that rewards big market teams and penalizes small market teams by forcing young, talented players to go into these small market teams. But whether you think it's good or bad, the question now becomes, with the new lottery rules intact, is tanking over? And I believe it is. I think tanking as we know it is over. When the rules are changed so that now 20 of the league's 30 teams have a chance of making it to the playoffs via the play-in tournament, and the odds of the draft lottery make it so that the 3 worst records in the NBA now have an equal chance at the #1 overall draft pick, and with the margin and odds between the worst record in the league and the 9th worst record in the league being reduced from over 23% to now just being 8%, then the incentive to tank games is reduced significantly. If your goal is to make the playoffs, there's more opportunities now to make it. And if your goal is to get the highest draft pick possible, you also now don't have to lose as many games as you can because there's a significantly less guarantee you actually get the pick you want if you just tank games. Now, I do still think that there's still going to be teams that just know they're better off getting a generally high draft pick than trying to make it to the playoffs. So I don't think we're in this system when there's literally zero incentive to tank because every single team can compete for a championship and having a bad record doesn't gain you a good draft pick. But what I do believe is that these new changes are great and have significantly de-incentivized tanking. Now, what do I think of all of this? I don't think there's a problem with teams recognizing that just perennially being a first round exit isn't a good thing, even though you're technically making it to the playoffs every year. So I also don't blame and I also don't mind when teams purposely don't try to compete as much as they can so they can get better assets in a draft. However, I do believe there is a balance. There is a balance between doing what I just said and purposely losing games to the nth degree like the way the Sixers did. And I truly do love what the new changes did, because it made it so that if you are one of those rebuilding teams, you don't have to tank so bad to get a good draft pick. Try to develop your players. Try to build a winning culture. And if it happens to be the case that you just don't make the playoffs, you can still get a good draft pick in the upcoming draft. I think that's the beauty of this new system. So that's my thoughts on if I think tanking was good or bad for the league, or is good or bad for the league. But I also want to speak on tanking in the lens of, yo, did this shit actually work, or was it just a gimmick that really didn't end up resulting into anything? And to that I say, I think tanking works. I think tanking works. Abusing the system to get the most valuable draft pick, the most valuable asset you can get in an upcoming draft, in theory, should work. It should work, and in my opinion, I feel like it would work, especially if you're doing it consecutive years. However, in practice, and this isn't every team, but a lot of these teams that do end up tanking have bad to mediocre management in the first place. So when they get these valuable assets, these valuable players, they just end up mismanaging the situation and end up wasting it. And inevitably, you just never become the championship team you intended to when you were tanking all of those years and giving your fan base and the NBA as a whole a bad product. Because you can have all of these high draft picks, but if you draft poorly, if you can't develop talent, if you mismanage assets through trades, and just make moves that create teams that end up being underwhelming and just never truly become a championship contender, then what do those high value assets really mean? What do they really mean? Those high value assets then serve no purpose if you're not really using them. Like if I was Jay-Z, right, and I was just handing out $500,000 to folks, but all of the people I gave that money to just ended up wasting that money, then what does giving that money really do? What does drafting LeBron James do if you can't provide him a proper supporting cast? For the 76ers, what do all of those high draft picks mean when you draft bad, when you don't take fit into account, not only in your draft picks, but in other acquisitions as well, and the two players you actually struck gold on just don't schematically fit on the court? What do those high draft picks really mean? But that's just me. That's just my thoughts. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Go ahead and check out the Let's Keep It a Buck podcast. Links will be in the description and in the pinned comment, man. But with that being said, I'm out. Peace.